All right, let's dig into this. Brendan, will you check your IMs? Let's dig into this this story here. I just let's play first this clip. This is Steve Bannon. He's no longer with us. I mean, he's alive, but he's no longer with the Trump administration. He's in Europe, and
he doesn't look super alive, but
he's as alive as he ever was. Let's put it that way. And this is him back in CPAC of 2017. That's over the summer, right? CPAC. And so we're really only talking 5 or 6 months into the election of Donald Trump. And here is what he had to say at CPAC.
Steve.
Yeah, I think the same thing. I think if you look at the lines of work, I kind of break it out into 3 verticals or 3 buckets. The first is kind of national security and sovereignty, and that's your intelligence, the Defense Department, Homeland Security. The second line of work is what I refer to as economic nationalism, and that is Wilbur Ross at Commerce, Steve Mnuchin at Treasury, Lighthizer at Trade, Peter Navarro, Stephen Miller, these people that are rethinking how we're going to reconstruct our trade arrangements around the world. The third...
I will note one thing. That, and I'm not sure about Lighthizer, but I have a feeling. What? Every single one of those people that he just mentioned back in the summer of 17, despite the fact that we've had, 40 top Trump officials, I'm just pulling that number out of my arse, as it were, but have had to go. The only ones that remain are the ones that he just mentioned.
Around the world. The third, broadly, line of work is what is deconstruction of the administrative state. And if you... So I think the 3 most important things, I think one of the most pivotal moments in modern American history was his immediate withdrawal from TPP. That got us out of a trade deal and let our sovereignty come back to ourselves. The mainstream media don't get this, but we're already working in consultation with the Hill. People are starting to think through a whole raft of amazing and innovative bilateral trading relationships with people that will reposition America in the world as a fair trading nation and start to bring jobs, high value added manufacturing jobs back to the United States of America. On the national security part, it was certainly the first 2 EOs that you've started to see implemented here over the last couple of days under General Kelly, and that is the rule of law is going to exist when you talk about our sovereignty and you talk about immigration. General Kelly and Attorney
Pause
General...
it for 1 second. I want to make something clear. When he's talking about national security, he's not talking about terrorism. He's not talking about anything other than immigration.
Demographics.
He's talking about demographics. And he's talking about militarizing our immigration policies. Okay, good.
He's talking about securing a future for white children.
Attorney General Sessions are adamant, that, and you're going to start to see, I think, with the defense budget we're going to talk about next week when we bring the budget out, and also with certain things about the plan on ISIS and what General Mattis and these guys think. I think you'll start to see the other part of that. But the third, this regulation, every business leader we've had in is saying not just taxes, but it is also the regulation. And I think if you look at these cabinet appointees, they were selected for a reason, and that is the deconstruction. The way the progressive left runs is if they can't get it passed, they're just going to put it in some sort of regulation in an agency. That's all going to be deconstructed, and I think that's why this regulatory thing is so important.
We had Dr.
So Mick Mulvaney was also one of those original cabinet appointees who came in at the Office of Management and Budget. And when it became clear that his project of slashing the budget was not going to happen, right? Our spending has skyrocketed, in part largely because of the tax cuts. This budget bill that they're talking about now will provide no cuts, and they'll kick the debt ceiling 2 years down the road. I'll talk about that later. I just note that so that you can be clear on what they're talking about when their agenda is. It's not about shrinking the size of government in terms of dollars. It is shrinking the capacity of government to make sure that profits are not privatized on the backs of social expenses that we all bear. That's basically what it comes down to. That's what deconstructing the regulatory state means. And we talked a little bit about this story early in the week, but I just wanted to because to highlight this stuff, because it's not being borne out. And I keep thinking about the interview that we did, I think it was in December of 2016, with Sam Bagenstos, who was a DOJ, who was in the DOJ under Clinton and then again under Obama. He said 8 years at the DOJ under the Bush administration not destroyed, but seriously hampered that agency. That it took at least 4 years to rebuild it in many respects. And I think what we're seeing under Trump is a far more severe assault. I think far worse than even that you got under 8 years of Bush. They are looking to destroy these agencies permanently. They're not looking, remember, they want to cut them, right? They couldn't name them, but they wanted to cut them. But instead of cutting them, what they're doing is they're hollowing them out, which is worse in many respects because we just presume that they're there and that these agencies are functioning to provide us the same sort of governmental services that they have in the past, and they're not. I'd mentioned this story about the USDA the other day. I'm going to reiterate it. The USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Department, is leaving Washington, D.C. and moving to Kansas City. 2/3, I want you to just contemplate wherever you work. What would happen if you lost 2/3 of the employees? And particularly ones that are like highly specialized. If you lost 2/3 of the employees over the course of a 2 or 3 month period. So everyone was given a choice. You either move or you leave the agency. 2/3 of them declined to move. 99 of 171 employees at the Economic Research Service. This is a federal statistical agency, part of the USDA. Who's going to use federal statistics the most? Other agencies and lawmakers. Where are they located? They're located in Washington. Are they just going to look at a piece of paper? No, they're going to want to sit down with the people who have developed these statistics. They want to find out the nuances behind it, what accounts for this. You meet in person. If you work in any type of business, if you work remotely, you understand the relevance of close proximity, even in this telecommunicating world. Close proximity. At the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which manages a $1.7 billion portfolio in scientific funding, 151 of 224 employees declined to relocate. That agency is going to be restaffed with people who have no idea what the agency does, have no history with the agency. Many of these people are scientists who have been there for literally a decade or two. And not only have they been there for a decade or two, they represent decades worth of institutional knowledge because they were trained by people who were there 10, 15, 20, 30 years earlier. And if you've ever been involved with a business that has high turnover, you understand the implications of that. I don't care if you own a restaurant and you have to replace all of your waiters each week. I mean, forget about it. Meanwhile, the Bureau of Land Management is also being subjected to the same thing. It would remove 300 employees from a key Interior Department agency, among them the majority of top managers, and move them and disperse them out west to different states. If I wanted to dismantle an agency, this would be in my playbook, said Steve Ellis, who retired as BLM's deputy director in 2016 after nearly 4 decades in government service. Transferring so many employees out of Washington could complicate the agency's relationship with Capitol Hill. It's the vast majority of management staff and getting them out. It's important that these agencies have a significant imprint in D.C., said the former head of the agency. Meanwhile, at HHS, Health and Human Services, apparently there's been a decent amount of telecommuting. They come in, I don't know if it's 2 days a week or 3 days a week or how it works. But the idea is that Washington, D.C. is more expensive. People spend a lot of time in their car. A lot of this agency's work does not involve direct communications with staff on the Hill. They still come in, and the agency is now demanding that people come in as a way of putting pressure on them. They have done a survey, and the survey found that many people would leave HHS if they institute this. And it appears that's why they're contemplating doing it. When we talk about deconstruction of the administrative state, the labor secretary. Wait a second, I get two more things. We've seen what's happening with the EPA in terms of regulation. They're rolling back specific regulations. They've also, and I mentioned this briefly the other day, they are eliminating the ability of individuals or community advocates to appeal against EPA-issued pollution permits before a panel of agency judges. Now, industrial permit holders, they can still appeal to this board, but individuals or community advocates can't. So if you want to fight an EPA rule that has been issued now, and you live in a community and you're being, well, here's an example. Emerson Addison, an unemployed English teacher in Clare County, Michigan, last year filed an appeal with the board after the EPA issued a permit to the Muskegon Development Company to inject water into a defunct oil well in Addison's community in an effort to reconstitute the well. I want you to contemplate now what the possible damage could be done by injecting water into an old oil well. If any of you live in a rural area, you understand the implications of this. You have a water supply. There are aqueducts under the ground, or aquifers. And you get stuff into there, you're cooked. Mr. Addison feared that in the process, contaminated water would leak from the well into the local water supply. This is a poor area, he said. Most people don't have the money to fight something like this in court. That's what the purpose of this board was, because anybody could go to the board and appeal a ruling. In fact, in April, the Environmental Appeals Board sent the permit back to the EPA for revision, ruling that it wasn't clear if the agency had sufficiently considered public comments or the effects of the plan on the poor and minority members of the nearby community. Well, that process, gone. Gone. It'll still exist. If you're a permit holder, it just won't exist if you're a community anymore or an individual. Appointing Eugene Scalia to be labor secretary. As you know, he was the son of the blessedly late Antonin Scalia. He has spent most of his career at a white shoe law firm fighting government regulation. He's done legal work for Ford Motor, Steve Wynn Casinos, UBS, UPS, MetLife, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, the Business Roundtable. Really, I mean, if you wanted a who's who of people, of entities that have attacked labor over the years. In a 2012 profile, Wall Street Journal called him one of the industry's go-to guys for challenging financial regulations. In 2006, he helped Walmart fight against a Maryland law that would have required companies with more than 10,000 workers to either spend at least 8% of their payroll costs on healthcare or pay into a state Medicaid fund. We know why Acosta got fired was ostensibly because he gave a sweetheart deal to Jeffrey Epstein. It also turns out that Mick Mulvaney, who's now the chief of staff, right, who's been there since the beginning, who after it became clear that he wasn't going to be able to slash the government's budget because Donald Trump realized you need to pay money out to get elected. He went on to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There, he basically shut the agency down. He didn't have the ability to dismantle it, couldn't get Congress to cut its funding, so he basically just stopped all of its enforcement procedures. I don't think they've brought a single enforcement procedure in the past 3 years. So I think largely this is his project. He had chewed out Alex Acosta during a meeting this year. Because according to the Washington Post, he was dragging his feet on regulation rollbacks desired by business interests and was on thin ice as a result. What else do we have? OSHA has the lowest number of inspectors it's had in decades. It is doing the fewest number of in-depth investigations into the health and safety of workers than anybody apparently can remember. I should just add that the EPA just recently also decided that its investigation into chlorophyllis that creates neurological defects in kids, we're going to go ahead with that one. This is the project, and this is just the ones that we know about. I mean, God knows, we know at the the Department of Education, all of the regulations regarding for-profit universities and colleges completely roll back. All you need to do is look at the stock portfolios, the stock funds that trade in that to know how significant that is. The only other thing I can tell you, and the Trump administration is quietly, and this gets to that point about Steve Bannon when he talks about national security. What he's talking about is literally the hue of national security, like literally the color of our country. Because the Trump administration, according to the LA Times 2 or 3 days ago, has quietly dismantled or cut back multiple programs that were created after September 11th. Oh, they're not going to be spying on people as much? No, that's not what it is. that detect and prevent terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction. In other words, scientists who are developing ways to assess whether a nuclear suitcase is coming in through shipping and whatnot. I would imagine this stuff slowed down commerce in some fashion. They have canceled training exercises. There have been scores of scientists and policy experts who have left. Paul Ryan, not the horrible one, but a retired Navy Rear Admiral, said what we had done in the past was analytically based. What are the threats? Where can we get the most return on the taxpayer's investment for security? He led the Homeland Security's Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, and he said, we're not as secure as we were 18 months ago. So you have all of this assault on the administrative state. Remember, there was also a lot of stories by, I think if you look into Jeff Hauser, I think there was a number of stories talked about how the Trump administration was putting in basically shadow heads at all these agencies. People who did not have to be confirmed by the Senate because they were supposedly temporary, and they just keep putting in a successive number of temporary heads who are just basically tasked with destroying an agency. This is super easy to understand. Demolition is much easier than building something. Demolition is much easier than maintaining something. You can do demolition wrong, but it only just creates more of a mess or is slightly more dangerous. But in this instance, the danger is not to you, it's to the people who use these services. And the mess, nobody cares. There's one other track on this assault on the administrative state, and this doesn't seem to be going as well for the Republicans, and that's at the Supreme Court. This can change, but we kept talking this year about a couple of cases. One was Kaiser. I might be mispronouncing that. Kaiser. In the past, you've heard me talk about the Chevron doctrine, which is what the court ruled in mid-1980s, where the court determined that when Congress is unambiguous in terms of passing a statute and empowering an agency to carry out that statute, you have to defer to the expressed intent of Congress. But there are times where Congress does not directly address the precise question at issue. So Congress says to the EPA, you regulate any material that is toxic. But they didn't know about compound triple Z. It had not been developed, or people weren't aware of it, or wasn't being in use. And the EPA finds like, this is toxic, so we're going to regulate it. Congress didn't say regulate compound triple Z. It just said find stuff that's toxic. So if the statute is silent or ambiguous with respect to a specific issue, the question that the court settled was whether the agency's answer is based on a permissible construction of the statute. So it gives wide berth to the agency to sort of assess whether it has authority here.
Not being absolute literalists.
Well,
Like literally do your job, not just because, oh, that doesn't specifically
Exactly.
say X.
so basically, Chevron says that an agency can interpret a statute unless it's in clear contradiction to what Congress wanted. There is another doctrine called the Auer, AUER doctrine that came from a case in the late 90s, Our v. Robbins, that allows an agency to interpret its own regulation unless it's obviously erroneous or inconsistent. So, in other words, if the agency says, okay, compound triple Z cannot be used in any type of procedure that might allow it to possibly seep into groundwater. And the agency deems like, oh, wait a second, you're doing construction with this material. We determined that it could seep into groundwater. So the court's going to defer to the agency's ability to make that determination. And this guy, James Kaiser, was seeking disability benefits for PTSD from the VA. The VA in 1983 determined that Kaiser didn't suffer from service-related PTSD. In 2007, the agency reversed its finding, but did not provide him retroactive benefits. Kaiser said that determination of the VA was wrong, and he wanted the Supreme Court to overturn Our v. Robbins to say that the agency did not have the ability to make that policy, essentially. And the court ended up refusing. Right-wingers have been trying to push this for a long time, and it's not clear to me that they're done. But so on the courts right now, we're somewhat protected, but we'll see. But in terms of practice, it's going to take multiple terms of an administration that is committed to rebuilding these agencies so that they can actually just function and do what they're supposed to do. It's hard to build institutions. And once they get destroyed, it's hard to rebuild them. And I don't care whether it's like, the U.S. government short-circuiting institutions in Guatemala, or whether it's Donald Trump's administration and Mick Mulvaney stripping away institutional knowledge and human capital from these agencies that have been built to protect us. So it's something to keep an eye on, and it's something to keep in mind. They're not going to talk about it on CNN when they talk about the implications of this election or anything that the Trump administration is doing. But it's hugely important to just sort of your daily life, particularly if you are a person who is living in poverty or near poverty, or a person of any type of marginal community, or communities that have less political power, or frankly, if you're, anybody who's not a corporation.
Doesn't want your kid to have brain damage.
I
mean, that's the thing. Like, I don't put a huge amount of stock into maybe I should a bit more into like the kind of Lakoff stuff of like language framing, but I just feel like dismantling the administrative state sounds so much more exciting than, like apartheid and getting food poisoning, right? Like, there's nothing like that. That sounds so grand and theoretical. This is just Republican deregulation.
Right. Well,
it's just bad for you.
Lawlessness.
Like lawlessness, whatever you want to call it, but it is not. It's not like, yes, let's apply like brilliant management theories to the government so it's better. Which I feel like that's sort of like what he's cueing off when he says that. That's like Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich did all of that stuff. I read about how he was always referencing like trendy 90s management theory.
Yes.
So it's like, yeah, here's the bill. We're going to get rid of, pharma regulations to make it easier for heart medication to end up like, exploding your heart or whatever they were doing. And the language is like, like Edward S. Deming showed that you can reinvent the corporation and blah, blah, blah process. And it's like, dude, you're just doing handoffs to corporations. That's it.
Yeah, this is the, I mean, there was 10 years ago, arguments, libertarian arguments of like, the problem is corruption.
Right.
And it's because corporations buy our government. And so the way to keep corporations from corrupting our government is to make the government so small that corporations have nothing to get from them. But this is the point of this is there is a dynamic that's at play here. Someone's going to fill this vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. If there is a vacuum of power as to what happens to your average person, corporations will fill it. Period. End of story. And the more you debilitate the ability of our government to react to these things, the more corporate power there will be. And that's what this is about.
So I say vote third party, no matter what, no matter where you are. I don't care if you're in a swing state.
Wow, you're excited.
That's the perfect coda.
I've been sitting on that one for 40 minutes.
There you go. Honestly, I mean, there's so much at stake.
So I say vote third party.
There's so much at stake. And don't mistake what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that there, first of all, I don't know that there is a safe choice when we're talking about elections. But understand that the functioning of government is far beyond just like, I like this person or I don't like that person, I'm going to run for them. And the vast majority of your fellow Americans will not have access to this information, probably don't care about the information. And then a significant portion of them will also specifically not care. Like, I'm sort of aware of what you're saying, and I definitely don't care. I had a conversation with a guy who I like, and plumber. We were talking about the immigration stuff. What?
Wasn't Joe?
No, not Joe. But
hi, Joe.
But
how does it feel to not be a thing anymore since 2008?
And just the perception of like, there's a certain amount of just sort of like, I'm going to come up with a very simple catch-all answer so that I don't have to get into the nuance of some of this stuff. And resist that, folks. Understand, it's a massive government because we have 300 million people in this country. Fairly diverse country. Both in terms of like geography, psychology, demographics, and to provide for it is a complicated task. And they are dismantling our agencies. And I know it's technocratic and whatnot, but at the end of the day, this is the way that whatever services or ever policies that want to be pursued by whichever of your favored candidates want, this is the way that those things are going to be delivered. And if they're delivered improperly, it's also going to hurt the political agenda. People aren't judged just on the ideas. They're judged on the ability to deliver on those ideas. And between the courts and the agencies, it doesn't matter who you have as president. It's massive obstacles to actually delivering, even if, never mind the politics behind it. Even if you could deliver from a political standpoint and pass the perfect piece of legislation, carrying them out with agencies that have been completely decimated in terms of skills and a legal system that prohibits. I mean, the best part of Obamacare was the Medicaid expansion, and 1 million some odd, 2 million people didn't have access to it simply because the court decided some batshit crazy ruling that even though Congress could end Medicaid tomorrow and then restart Medicaid with the expanded version of Medicaid, they could not say, if you're going to take Medicaid, state, you need to expand it. But this court is willing to do what it takes to thwart any type of progress. And so these are important considerations.